So I've seen tons of articles along the lines of 5 things to do before buying your first house. Not one of them says, check what's out there for rent. See if you should be buying. It should be in there. It should be one of them. I call it step 0 because I think it should be first because it saves you a lot of their headache. But and because everyone else is like, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10, but never that, which is the implied step 0.
Sandy always talks about that, like clarity, ownership, all that stuff. I feel like step 0 is where a lot of ownership happens. Weirdly, ownership happens much before you own a house, maybe something.
Well, you gotta own the problem.
Hello, my friends. My name is Chris Entz, and welcome to another episode of Because Money. This week marks only the 3rd time that we've ever done an episode without the iridescent Sandy Martin, but I promise you, we've still got a good show for you. I will be joined by our resident housing bear, John Robertson, to talk about the ultimate housing question. Should you be renting or should you be buying? We talk about tangibles and intangibles and just how to think about the whole problem of where you should live. I hope you enjoy sitting in on our conversation. This is I think the whole idea of step 0 and the whole idea of having this conversation is that you always get borne down in kind of what feels like just the weeds of, but maybe this, and it's just like, where do you start? Where do you kind of have like that idea of should, that idea of right, that should. So like, if you're framing the question for somebody, should I even look at buying real estate? Like, where does that decision start for you? Like, how do you think about that? Or how do you wish people would think about it? Or how would you think about it? Or any of those things?
Well, the thing that I come to or start from is the old expression, you have to live somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, for a lot of people, that is a dangerous expression because they use it to justify buying a house at any price because you have to live somewhere. Like the only place you could live is in a house that you buy. But no, take it at face value for what it is. You have to live somewhere, which means you're either renting a place or you're buying a place.
Yeah.
And that place could be a condo. It could be an apartment. It could be a house, duplex, trailer. It could be in a big city like Toronto.
Yeah.
Or you could say, well, cost of living here is so much that even if I take a pay cut and move out to another city, I'm still going to have a better life because I won't be paying this much for a house and I won't be commuting. Oh my God. And
commuting is not fun. Do you think anybody thinks commuting is fun? Like if there's any, like one guy's like, I love my commute. And there probably is one guy who's like, I don't
drive downtown
and I learn languages. And it's amazing. And I do car crunches. Are car crunches a thing? Probably not.
Yeah. I mean, I read a lot on the subway.
Yeah.
I've got my Kobo and I read a lot. I like reading. I don't like reading on the subway. I'd much rather be at home with a 5-minute walk and then reading in my armchair on my couch rather than being forced to spend 2 hours every weekday reading on the subway. Much as I like reading,
there's the making the best of a situation, and there's the like it's the framing. I would say that there is a third option to you have to live somewhere. There's the renting, and then there's the buying, and then there's the freeloading option. It's an excellent option. Let's not take it off the table. Yeah. And I'm not just talking about millennials in their 20s or whatever age group is going through their 20s at whatever era, living on their parents' basements, but just also people that are jumping from friend's couch to friend's couch, people that are doing all kinds of fun things to creatively solve the problem of a place to live without the struggle of money.
There was actually on I think it was Reddit a couple of weeks ago an interesting thread where that was sort of the guy's main problem. He's like, I live with my parents and I'm totally fine with them. I don't have big concerns living with them and interpersonal friction, but I like going out and they don't live very close to downtown, which means, most weekends I'm couch surfing and I hate it. So I'm going to buy a condo downtown. And it's like, whoa, there are other options. Yes, exactly. And it's like, look at how much a condo costs. Like, if you're okay otherwise living in your parents' place and it's close to your work and all
Yeah.
these other great factors, I mean, I moved out of my parents' place at 22 in part because I went off to university, in part because I was ready to move out of my parents' place.
Totally.
I was done
Yeah.
sharing a roof with them. And lots of other people, sometime in their mid 20s, hit about the same point where like, nope, I'm out. But if this
100%.
guy is totally fine living with his parents, it's a very economical, cheap way to live.
Totally.
And then if his only problem is that on the weekends he's couch surfing and that's inconvenient and he doesn't like it, I mean, a hotel room a couple times a month is a lot cheaper than a condo,
Seriously.
and it might be more fun.
Super fun. If you're just
Yeah.
looking for a place to crash, done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somehow that never makes the blog list, though.
Yeah.
Before
Well,
you
that's
buy,
a pretty unique situation. But
consider a hotel room. Yeah. So that's a place to start. But yeah, so I do accept your premise of you need a place to live.
you need a
Totally
place-
accept that premise.
that's exactly it. So you need a place to live. And so you start by looking what's out there for rent, what's out there to buy. And another common stumbling block is people think, well, renting equals 1 or 2 bedroom apartment.
Yeah. Especially in a
And
city like Toronto. Like,
yes.
although I think that that's across the board in a city, because you think about renting as a phase of life. This is this kind of idea that's like renting is something you do from your 20s, maybe into your 30s, when you would function well in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And so even renting later in life becomes a conversation about, could you raise a family in a 1 bedroom apartment?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. It's like renting as an idea really isn't, and I'm probably jumping ahead in kind of how you're thinking about things anyways, but it's interesting to be like that. When you say people think about it being a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, that totally seems true because that's the people who rent. People rent
And
1 or 2 bedroom apartments.
and most rentals are 1 or 2 bedroom apartments, or equivalently condos that are functioning as 1 or 2 bedroom apartments.
Yeah.
But there are houses for rent, and people don't even think that that's an option.
Yeah.
You can go out and find in lots of great neighborhoods with great schools, full detached houses, exactly like the ones that you might have grown up with your parents. It's exactly like the ones to your left and to your right that are owned by the owners, that for whatever reason people are renting out. It's either an income property for a landlord, it's a speculative bet on the housing market that they just need to fill to cover some of the ongoing operating costs until they can flip it. Or it's someone was living in that house and then they got transferred for work and they didn't want to sell it.
Yeah.
And then they let you live there for a couple of years until maybe they come back, or maybe they realize that now it's just a place where the tenants live because they're not coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. I guess when I think about that, immediately I feel, and I actually, like, even though I've been a renter for a long time, rarely have I looked at prices for detached houses because I feel like the cost would be prohibitive. I feel like there wouldn't be a lot and that they would be super expensive. And I don't know why. Maybe that's not true. And obviously, I'm speaking from a Toronto because that's where I've been looking lately, from the idea of renting in Toronto, which is expensive anyways. But like, it's all relative, right? That it would be super expensive compared to what I could get somewhere else.
Yes, it is. And I look at the detached market a lot because I live in a detached house and I'm never going back to sharing a wall with someone as long as I can reasonably afford not to.
Yeah, my neighbor plays weird
I hate
music.
neighbors.
He's right through this wall here, and it's everything from really old classical music where you hear a weird vibrato and it's like loud old movie. It's just weird, and he starts listening to it around 9 p.m. through 11:30 to 1:30 p.m. Doesn't listen to it at any other time. Super loud.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what the specifics are for me. Just knowing that there's another person that close to me just gets my skin crawling. I just no, I physically need the space of buffer between me and other human beings.
Totally.
I don't know why I live in a city. I really should be out in a country somewhere, but that's just where I am. So I rent a detached house.
Yeah.
And have for several years rented a detached house, and if I ever move, I will probably move into another detached house, likely another one that I will rent.
Yeah.
So that is an option. And yes, it is expensive. It's going to be more expensive than a one-bedroom apartment
Of
or
course,
two-bedroom apartment, what
because
have
it's
you.
just more space.
But exactly, buying a house is more expensive than buying a one-bedroom condo or a two-bedroom condo.
Yeah.
What's really surprising, though, is that in Toronto, that difference grows faster when you're looking to buy the place. And that's where the really big rent versus buy differences start to come in play.
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit, because that's where I kind of lose, or maybe my brain starts to get a little fuzzy, because it's just like, it feels like, when we've talked about this before too, it feels like you talk about the rent versus buy equation,
Mm-hmm.
and like there's some kind of secret thing that you can plug in that will give you the right answer for whether, at least the financial right answer, and there's other things to kind of consider about whether it's worth it to buy or rent. So, like, is that a thing?
So, yes and no.
Okay.
So, it's not the answer, it's the cloud of answers, because unfortunately, this is another one of those situations where there's uncertainty in real life.
Okay.
And this depends on a number of factors and assumptions, a lot of which you can get really close on. For instance, you know what the rent of a place is because you can look up the listing,
Yeah.
and you know what the equivalent place would be to buy because you can look up the listings for those. And in some cases, they're the same place because someone needs to move out of their house and they don't care whether they rent it or sell it. They just need to get out themselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll find that there'll be a dual listing, rent or buy. So you can compare like directly the exact same place. Here's how much for rent, here's how much to buy.
That's really interesting.
And that gives you like a really good insight into how the rental market is in your city if you can find rent listings like that. Because then it's exactly apples to apples.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing, is that there's going to be a little bit of uncertainty. You're going to have to make some predictions, and you're going to look at how the future playing out in different ways might affect you. So you might not just look at one set of numbers to get one answer, but to get sort of a range of answers and then say, well, yes, if prices keep going up 20% per year in Toronto, then yeah, I'd be better off buying. But how realistic is that? And if prices stay flat or even go down, I'd be a lot worse off buying. And then you can make your decision based on that. So you can look at that. You can take your sort of baseline set of assumptions and then see what the difference is financially. So for instance, if I look at a detached house in Toronto these days, it might be $1.5 million to buy like a 3-bedroom
depending
detached
where you're
house.
looking at, right?
Not even downtown. I'm talking like
that's not downtown.
Yeah.
It maybe was 6 years ago or something like that, but it's not really downtown anymore.
Yeah. And to rent pretty much the same place might be $3,000, $3,600, $4,000 a month. I'm going to go with $3,600 because I found a couple listings right at that price point last time I looked.
So $3,600 to rent, $1.5 million to buy.
$1.5 million to buy.
Okay.
So yeah, that rent is pretty expensive, especially if you're comparing to, a basement apartment somewhere.
Totally.
$800 a month basement apartment in Scarborough, or $1,500 for a 1-bedroom condo downtown, or whatever. That's a lot of money, but $1.5 million is a lot of money too.
It's true, but it's so much of a different conception mentally. You know what I mean? Like 1.5 million is a really, like, my mind can't really wrap around that. But when you talk about $3,600 a month, I go, I just don't know how that would work. And like, because I have a way better conception of how that would actually kind of affect me. So
so the first thing people do then to try to make them comparable. They'll look at the monthly. And so they go, oh, well, I'll put this much down on the house, and then what's my monthly mortgage payment? And that's the really naive rent versus buy, the wrong way to do it.
Okay.
But even then, mortgage payment, assuming 2.5% on your mortgage that you're putting 20% down, is $5,376 a month.
So even with the super naive way to ignore all the other costs of home ownership, the risk assumed, all the other stuff, the fact that interest rates at 2.5 is probably not something that's going to happen at all, you're still looking at a huge difference. You said, what was it, 5,000?
5,376 rounded up versus 3,600.
So not quite $2,000 difference, but in that range, almost $2,000 difference.
Yeah.
Man, okay, that's huge.
No property taxes, no maintenance.
Yeah,
Now, to be fair, you're building equity, but we'll get to that later.
for sure. Like that's
Yeah,
the kind of it's you have to think about it in little pieces here. So
yeah,
I will totally afford you that time before I
yeah.
raise a
So
snafu.
that you can get the financial answer. And in this case, the financial answer is unless you have wildly optimistic views on continued price appreciation,
Yeah,
you're going to be better off renting. And if you assume some sort of like relatively moderate level of price inflation, you're looking that over the course of the next 10 years, that's going to cost you like 100 grand
yeah,
to buy it versus rent it, just to live in the same place.
okay,
And so then you can start to bring in the non-financial factors, because a lot of times people skip to the non-financial factors and go, oh, I have pride of ownership. It's really important to me to own my house, to have
yeah,
my own space. As much as I don't like living with my parents, I don't want to live under landlord's roof either, which again, if you've ever lived out on your own, most landlords are pretty good and you'll never see them except for like the once a year that you renew your lease,
yeah. Well,
right?
and it
Or
becomes a
something
thing
breaks.
too. The nice thing, if you end up with a landlord that you really don't connect with, you're
You
not.
can leave.
You can leave. That's the advantage. It's just like
Yeah.
there may be terrible landlords out there that you would hate to live under their roof, and you can leave and find a different place. That is your
Yeah.
right. You owe them nothing except for the lease that you sign. But there's flexibility there.
Yeah. So people say, I've got pride of ownership,
Yeah,
therefore house. But I mean, you really can't skip that step because, I could have pride of ownership of a Ferrari. Doesn't mean it fits my budget. Like, I really can't afford to have a Ferrari as my daily driver. I drive a Prius, and that is plenty of pride of ownership for me and about as much car as I can afford in my budget.
it's.
I'm
I guess the difference.
just because I'd enjoy it more doesn't mean I can justify spending that much money. And so when you lay it out in a rent versus buy calculator, you see financially what the difference is. Then you can say, well, is my pride worth
Totally.
10 grand a year?
Totally. And I think that
Yeah.
that's like it's always really good to kind of quantify the non-quantifiable. Like you can't put a
Mhm.
price on pride of ownership, but you can say, is it worth this? You can put a
Yes,
comparative. You can
exactly.
say, I don't know what it's worth, but would it be worth $10,000 a year?
It's like art. I, I don't know if it's art or I don't know exactly if it's good or not, but this I like or this I don't like, right?
Well, and it really when you have to put like, man, this is the always funny thing with art because people love art, but then you ask, will you pay for art? And then you realize that people love it a lot, or if they're just like, well, like I like that you're doing it over there. It's like, if you love
Yeah.
art, will you buy a $1,500 subscription to this thing? No. But the interesting thing when you're talking about like a car parallel, and I totally get that, but the little bit of the problem with the idea of saying, I want the pride of ownership over my place to live, is that the barrier to entry there, if you're in a community where you're not willing to move to a much lower thing, we can talk about that at some point too, but like there's there's no way to get the Prius versus Ferrari version unless you consider, like, if you're really limiting yourself to saying pride of ownership, pride of I can knock that wall over in my house and there's nobody that can come sue me for it, like you could say that I want ownership over my own space, and you can do that in a bunch of different ways. Even if you're renting, you can kind of become a more serious renter, but like there isn't quite that like way that you can say the barrier to entry just seems larger. It's like, I want pride of ownership, but I can't get it in this range. I can only get it here, and that's frustrating for
Yeah.
people that have that as a priority.
But
It's a
it's the
reality
sad
too.
world that we live in.
No.
And I'm very open at calling it's a housing bubble. I'll put the name on it. Yeah. But that's the reality of living in a
Yeah.
housing
Yeah.
bubble.
I think the thing that's interesting, because people are crazy in this market right now, especially when you talk about
Yes,
Toronto.
that's an excellent adjective.
But they are, because it's just like they've seen the 20% growth, and they're just like, and this is, I talk to friends all the time who are like, people are worried, they're worried that they're going to get shut out forever. So that
Yeah.
and it's this like that desperation can add even more fuel to this idea of ignoring. It's like how in Toronto, and I'm sure in Vancouver too, when you're buying a place, that they're waiving all these things that used to be home inspections, all these normal kind of prudence measures that you used to do to make sure you're getting a good asset. They don't talk about that anymore. And
Mhm.
so it's people are doing that mentally. Like you don't have the time to sit down and think about buying an asset anymore. Because like, well, what if next week it goes up another 10% and you'll never be able to afford it? And even if it goes down a little bit, you'll be shut out of the market forever. And you want to be like, they've got you a little bit by the short and curlies there, because it's
Yeah.
like, what am I supposed to do? You come to me and you're like, do you want to own? You're like, well, I don't know. Do you want to own ever? You're like, well, maybe. Well, then give me all the money all the time and work it out later, because we're going to shut you out of the market. That's scary, and it doesn't
Yeah.
make a rational brain work well. And your rational brain works far better than most, and so this is why we lean on you for ration.
Well, it's extremely difficult because it's housing bubbles are slow, and people like you can look back at a chart and you say, oh, there's the 1989 Toronto housing bubble. Look, it went up for a couple of years and then it crashed for a couple of years and bottomed out and very, very slowly recovered.
Yeah.
And whatever, it was like 7 years start to finish. 7 years is a long time,
When you're living in
and
it.
this one is slower.
Yeah.
So it's been at least 9 years since we first crossed the point where renting was a little bit better than buying. And it's just gotten worse and worse and worse ever since then. And it's been about 5 years that lots of people have started to notice that and speak up about it in Toronto. So that's a long time for someone to say, okay, yeah, maybe I'll buy into this renting thing, and then still not have prices correct and still not have prices correct, and have it just get more and more expensive. And then it starts to look like it will never come back.
Yeah.
And then there's two basic responses to that. One is, well, eventually, yeah, it's going to come back because trees don't go to the sky. As much as people like to say Toronto's the next Tokyo or New York, I mean, really flip that on its head and say, is New York the next Toronto? And you go, that's a ridiculous comparison. Like, Toronto is nothing like New York. Okay, it's a city. It has a subway, sort of, and property prices are going up. But it's really like, it's hard to make the case that Toronto prices should be to the level that New York prices are, which is really all people have left to justify prices continuing to go up any further from here, because there's no other reason. Toronto incomes don't support it. Toronto rents don't support it. It's largely just the madness of crowds, as they call it. And the other approach, the other response to that fear of missing out is, so what if you do?
Yes.
Renting forever, is it really that bad? Or getting the fuck out, is it really that bad? Like, if Toronto gets to the point where a house that's already 1.5 million becomes 2 million or 3 million, like, at some point it just doesn't matter anymore. It's just, I'm never going to own, so what? I can still make a life here as a renter, or I can sort of take my chips, take my kid, take my car, go to some other city. And make a life there, because, Charlottetown, Halifax, London, Ontario, they're not going to be the next New Yorks, even if Toronto does, by some miracle, become it.
Well, and there's something to learn, too, about people that live in those other huge cities, that they're full of renters. You go to Paris, you go to New York, you go to, I don't know about Tokyo. I assume with Tokyo, because that's the state of these cities, is that lots of people throughout their lives rent. And the kind of culture builds up around that. It's totally fine, but it is,
But even Tokyo becoming Tokyo went through a real estate bubble.
Exactly. That's really. But okay, so when you were kind of talking, and this is always something that I mean to ask you for like a long time, because it's whenever we talk about real estate, we get caught in the exceptionalism and the insanity of the Toronto/Vancouver bubble. One, because we live in Toronto and because it's really immediate, but also just because it's crazy. And so it's really interesting to talk about. But within this rent versus buy thing, you talked about the idea of like, I think you said it's been 9 years since the kind of rent kind of clicked over it being worth it to buy. So can we talk a little bit about just like the idea of like the normal situation? It still exists in lots of communities where it's like this is where renting is good, and then at a certain point it hits a kind of plateau. Is that related to your income? Is that related to your life stage where buying becomes a better deal? Like how would normal
It's
people think of it that or people that Toronto in 20 years?
yeah. So it's not so much related to you. It's more a function of the
Okay.
market.
Okay. That's
So
nice.
when it comes to you, the biggest thing that you're going to put into this comparison, how this is going to work, is how long you're going to be there, because there's huge transaction costs to real estate. It costs a ton of money. Like if you look at 5% realtor commission plus a couple percent land transfer tax plus a couple $1,000s for your lawyer, your notary, your home inspector, if you're even doing that these days, and moving truck, which, well, if you're a renter and you move, you have to pay for that anyway. With those extra costs just of being an owner, I mean, that's in some cases several years worth of paying for rent just in the transaction costs. So that's one area where your situation is going to really may have a part to play in the comparison. And so for my own life, like I'm not a perma bear. I've been a bear on real estate for a long time. I'm not a perma bear. I moved to London in 2003 when I moved out of my parents' place, and my dad and I looked at places, and it did at the time make sense to buy. And the only reason we didn't was because I couldn't do it on my own. I would need my dad's help. And he was at the time willing to potentially help me with that. But I was going to London originally for a master's program, which was going to nominally be 2 years. If you go and you buy a place and then you move back to Toronto 2 years later, you're just hosed on the fees. And so even if I was going to live there for a longer time, it would make sense to buy. For 2 years, it didn't. Now, I ended up living in London for 10. So if I had bought in 2003, I would have been doing okay. Because I did my master's, it ended up taking 3 years instead of 2. I did my PhD, I did my postdoc, all of that in London. So it might have made sense at that time then to have bought right away in 2003.
So what are the factors that you looked at that made it worth it? Is it it's the same thing kind of that we were talking about before at the beginning, but kind of how does that lay out?
It's basically the biggest thing is, or the quickest math is just to take the price to rent ratio. So if you take the rent, the monthly rent, and you take the price, which is the price, and you divide the two. And then that gives you a number. So if you put the bigger number on top, you get a nice positive number rather than all these weird fractions. So if you take the price and you divide it by the rent, and it's like 10, that's super unrealistic, okay? But let's say that. So let's say that you could buy a place for $10,000 and the monthly rent is $1,000 a month. You are not going to have to pull out a calculator to figure out that it is not going to take very much for you to be better off buying that place.
But I have a calculator ready. You made the math too simple. I was so ready. Okay, perfect. Yes.
So way over on one end of the spectrum, you have really, really low rent to buy ratios. And you know that buying is going to be better in that case. And then at the other end, let's say that there was a place that cost $1 million. But you could rent it for $1,000 a month. Who knows what crazy landlord's going to give it to you for that?
Yeah, that's insane.
You could rent it for $1,000 a month or buy it for $1 million. I mean, you could stick your $1 million in a savings account and come out with enough money in even these low interest rate days to pay that kind of rent, let alone also paying the property taxes and whatnot on $1 million place. So that's 1,000 to 1 price to rent. So, up there, renting definitely makes sense. Like, it doesn't take a whole lot of math comparison. Down here, buying definitely makes sense. And so somewhere in between is the crossover point. And that's where you need to do a little bit of math to find the crossover point. And it depends on assumptions. Depends on a lot of assumptions. So that's where some people such as myself got into a little bit of trouble calling it a bubble too early, as it were, because interest rates crashed. Like from, a typical mortgage was 5 or 6% back in the ye old 2007, 2008 days. And then 2009 mortgages were 3.5%.
Yeah.
And then they went down to 3%, and
Yeah.
then 2.5%. And if you had assumed that you wanted to be prudent and provide some margin for rates to go back up, if you had assumed 4, 5, 6% in your calculation of rent versus buy, you would have found that you needed a lower price for it to make sense. Whereas if you had, for some reason, which seemed insane at the time but ended up being correct, assumed that mortgage rates at 3.5% would stay at 3.5% and even go lower, then you could pay more and still have it come out making sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's where that exact crossover point is going to move, depending on that's just one example of your assumption.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of assumptions that are going to go into that. I think a good rule of thumb is somewhere around 200 times, maybe 225, is about where that crossover point is.
Okay. So just
so
because
if you pull your calculator out and you look at 3,600, 1.5 million.
Yeah, 1.5 million.
3,600 per month, which is what we're seeing in Toronto right now.
So, and then I divide those two. 1.5 is at the top, divided by 3,600.
Yeah, so it's 1.5 million. So like 1,500 divided by 3.6 if we're going to the thousands. That's 416 times.
Okay, so that's way over that mark of 200,
way over,
225.
so much that even if you make you have to make really wild assumptions
for that to make sense.
Yeah.
Like so that's it growing 20% every year and like craziness and interest rates staying low and all of that.
Yeah. Now, if interest rates do stay low and if prices do grow by 20% a year, I don't think that's a safe and reasonable assumption to be making when you're talking about the biggest expense you're going to have in your life.
Yeah.
But if you want to go with that, then it does make sense to buy even at these prices in Toronto.
Yeah. And
but of course, that's the problem, is it's the biggest expense you're going to get. This decision and getting it right is important.
Yeah. That's kind of the biggest crux that follows. You need a place to live. This is going to be a big decision whether you decide to rent or buy. You're putting a big portion of your monthly, annual, lifetime cash flow towards your living situation. So thinking about it is worth taking the time to think about it.
Yeah. And a large number of sacrifices have to be made if you end up buying overpriced housing. So if houses are, let's just say, 30% overvalued.
Yeah, okay.
Well, let's say that normally you would spend a third of your budget on housing and 10% saving for retirement.
Yeah.
Well, if you're spending 33% more on your housing because it's an inflated, crazy market, and you're just got the fear of missing out, so you spend more than you otherwise would on housing, well, that's got to come from somewhere. Now you're, instead of that 30%, you're at 39%. That's almost all of your retirement savings.
Yeah. But John,
unless you're cutting back elsewhere.
What if my house is my retirement?
So that is actually a point that comes up a lot.
It's a lot of people feel that way.
Astounding amount for how weak a point it is, which is a house is a forced savings plan, because when you're making that mortgage payment, part of that goes off towards paying off the principal, so that at the end you end up with a paid off house.
Yeah.
And if you have trouble saving, then buying a house is a way to force savings.
Yeah.
Now,
really common argument.
That if you need the threat of homelessness to save, you need a money coach, not a realtor. So,
like, I'm not going to argue with you, but like, I believe in the power of cash flow more than I believe in the power of Harry Potter. And
but no, as a homeowner, you have to save.
Yeah.
And not just by paying off the mortgage, because you're going to have to repair the house at some point.
Yeah.
There are large upkeep costs to being an owner, and they're irregular upkeep costs. You don't just, in some cases, you can go to something like Direct Energy or Energy and have some create a furnace protection, so you just pay monthly fee, and then you don't even have to worry about the furnace breaking down. They'll come in and pay it. And maybe one day someone will come up with the equivalent for roofs and foundations. But you do need, realistically, to be able to save money as a homeowner, if nothing else, for repairs, let alone your own retirement and
That's
stuff.
a really interesting thought. I really like that as kind of an argument to being like, my home is my forced savings program. Being like, no, it should not be forcing you to save. You should be able to save as a requirement before taking on the risk of home ownership, because the entire thing is another kind of lessons in risk taking, to be like, look, you're going to have variable costs throughout the life of this home, whether it's a condo, which is smaller, you reduce the risk, but whether it's a condo with your fridge and stove breaking, or a lifetime of a house,
Well, condos have special assessments.
and you're going to have giant spikes at some point. So if you can't manage those spikes, they're going to be a huge detriment to your ability to live, just live, let alone its effects on you, putting money into later life planning. Yeah, I like that a lot. That idea that like, no, this shouldn't force you to save. You have to be able to save before you start. Well, and isn't that like in a classic housing kind of thing, is like the barrier to entry should be you have to save up a down payment. If you can't save up a down payment, then maybe home ownership isn't right for you, simply because you're also going to have to keep saving. You're also like, you have to be able to manage that kind of thing. But people like to find ways to skip that.
Yeah, and I mean, we've got government-supported institutions to help circumvent that. I feel philosophically agree with existing in the way that they do, but that is potentially a whole episode on its own.
Matt, it really is, because it's like, without kind of going down that tangent, it's like you also have to helping people, because this is one of the frustrations that Mimi and I went through when we were kind of looking at buying property. It's just the fact that like it's hard for people that have the right habits, are prepared to just jump through the wealth hoops. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to start with that. So helping the people that are prepared, have thought it through, get to that stage. And I'm not trying to put myself in a noble group, but I know that there are always people that those kind of programs are like, yeah, that's perfect for you. But helping everybody, just simplifying it to the point of being like, we want to help people get the money to buy a house because this is what Canadians need, and it's for their security. And you're like, well, we're making wide swaths of assumptions there,
Yeah. And I mean, where I see things like CMHC being very justified is in small communities, because the rental stock doesn't exist to nearly the same extent that it does in big cities.
Completely.
And so if you want to move out of your parents' house, you have almost no other choice than to buy a place. And if you can't save up while you're in your parents' place because you just got to get out, or you got to move to one of these places for a job when you're a recent grad or whatever, and you don't have the savings yet, then it makes sense to have a program like this help you get in. And then on the flip side, the risk to the government is relatively minor, because these places generally don't experience massive housing bubbles where a regular 3-bedroom house ends up costing $1.5 million.
No, that makes
Whereas
a lot of
in
sense.
Toronto, I argue against the necessity of it, because you can always rent.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Nobody's homeless because they can't get CMHC. They just can't buy as early as they'd like.
Yeah.
But nobody's homeless.
But this is the other kind of giant, the problem that we always are bringing up. And this idea of like pride of ownership is one thing, but this idea that owning a home is something that Canadians just want. This is something that's like, and maybe it's got to be in other countries as well, but it seems like as Canadians specifically, people feel like owning a home is a stage that everybody has to go through. It's that same kind of like, in the same way that there's the pressure, or maybe that's fading a little bit, to like get married, have kids, do these things. Getting a house is one of these steps that still is kind of really ingrained in societal kind of things. And so like, that's it. Even though it's like, it seems like a weird thing to toss out into the world when we've been talking about actual tangible, like formulas, numbers, this is how you think about it. This is just, it's just, that's where it seems to come back to all the time. And so how do you have that discussion? How do you talk up renting or down, I don't know, balance out the conversation a little bit? It's frustrating.
Yeah, it really is. And it's very difficult because it is so ingrained. Like, I've heard other people call it a cult, and to some extent it kind of is. Like, it's just an automatic not a logic answer. It's just this is part of our culture.
Yeah,
Is we go off, we get to a certain age, and you buy a house, and you're not really seen as an adult within the community unless you have accomplished that.
it's really
And
true. It's amazing how, like, I can't remember if we were talking about this, and I'm sorry to interrupt after you, but it's like, if we were talking about this before, but, Mimi and I feel that some way too, and we're like, we're happy where we are, but when you talk to people and you're like, oh yeah, and we rent, and you kind of get this little twinge of shame, and you're like, I don't feel that. Why is this sparking up? Because it's like you feel like at a certain point, and you get a little bit of an allowance for living in Toronto. People are like, oh, I understand. But like when you're talking to people outside of that community that might not understand that, you're like, you're in your 30s. Why are you still renting? Why is that? Shouldn't you seem to be capable of doing more, doing better? Shouldn't you be doing better? Ugh.
yeah, no, it's hard, and these are the things that people have to balance off in a housing bubble, and it's really hard to try to find that middle ground that's going to work for you. Um, like for me, I know that I tend to not care that much about what other people think
Yeah,
because I'm again that antisocial loser that doesn't want to share a wall with another human being if I can at all spend a little bit more money to avoid it. But also, that's a mindset that I just sort of grew up with, is
yeah,
that the crowd is not always right
yeah,
just because it's the crowd, and in a number of ways that was sort of drilled into me, and so it's something that um, I've become comfortable with in other ways. But it is a really tough thing to do, to go against your culture, against your friends and family, to do something that's even just a tiny bit different. And so
totally.
one thing that I find really helps is, for the most part, people aren't looking at your mortgage statement or your rent checks. So if you're living the lifestyle that they expect you to live,
Yeah,
they might not even know or care or ask that, are you renting or buying that place? It's just, here's the house that I live in.
totally.
So they expect you to live in a certain style of house or condo or,
Yeah,
um, detached house or semi-detached, whatever,
yeah,
and then to procreate. And as long as you're doing that, you don't really get a whole lot of social stigma. And it's
yeah,
kind of funny that every now and then, like sometimes I'm really big, like, I rent this place. It's a
yeah,
great place. I live here and I rent it. Did you know that you can rent a house? Because I'm trying to like help people understand that yes, you can rent detached houses, and nice ones too, not just
totally.
like ones that are on the verge of being torn down to be replaced, that are
Yeah.
just getting their last year or two of rent checks. Like sometimes they're nice places that you can sign like 5-year leases on and live there for a long time and raise
Totally.
kids there and all that. So you live there and you raise kids, and then nobody gives you any kind of weird looks. But every now and then that you can see that they have assumed that you've bought the place, because you'll
Totally.
like have friends over for dinner and they're like, you should really knock this wall down. And I'm like, no, my landlord would not be cool
Mm.
with that. Or maybe I'll check with my landlord, because maybe they want this wall knocked down, in which case, yeah, I might as well spend a weekend doing it. And
You're
yeah,
totally right. I bet most people assume that you own your place because it's like it's a great place in a great neighborhood, and it's just like you would just assume that because you don't think about renting detached houses.
and also because 95% of the other houses in this neighborhood are
Yeah,
owned. I
yeah,
mean, I've seen, 2 or 3 on the block have gone up for rent over the last couple of years. So I know that it's somewhere around that level of, 5%, maybe 10% of the neighborhood is rented. But yeah, most of them are.
that's one other thing too that's worth kind of just you mentioned it in passing, but the idea of a long-term lease, the idea of a 5-year lease, the idea of a longer-term lease, the idea that leases are negotiable with your landlord. That's something that until you mentioned it, I think last fall, I was like, oh, right, leases can be longer than a year. And it does fill in a little bit of the gap because one of the perhaps legitimate ideas is that with renting, you don't have the stability that you have when you own. All of a sudden, an owner could call you up and be like, look, my cousin is moving in. You have to move out. And there's protections for that. But you also are a little bit at their whim. It happened just a couple of friends of mine. They sold the build. Their landlord sold the building. They have to leave. It can be really,
Yeah.
that can be tough. So there are solutions for gaining stability within a renting community too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it extends in so many different directions. So I mean, just to sort of circle back to the beginning of the point, there are trade-offs that are not financial.
Yeah.
And part of that is renting is going to be a little bit less secure, a little bit constrained in some ways that owning isn't. And some people are going to be uncomfortable with that. To some extent, you look at a market like Toronto and you say, well, suck it up, Buttercup. Like, that is the life that's the reality of life. Times are tough, and, it's two bad choices. This is the less bad choice.
Yeah.
So you can try to mitigate it in some ways.
Yeah.
So one way is with a longer lease. So in Ontario, the rule of the land is that a tenant has security of tenancy, and if they're in a place that was built and occupied before 1991, they also have rent control. So you move in, you negotiate the rent with the landlord at whatever the market rate is, and then after that, the government will say how much the maximum rent can go up each year.
Yeah.
You can also negotiate that directly with the landlord. So
Interesting.
the typical thing is to have a 1-year lease, and then after that, the rent goes up by whatever the government says, unless the landlord decides to not raise it by that much, which actually does happen because landlords want to incentivize good tenants to stay, because a good landlord wants a good tenant.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
Not all landlords are going to be in there trying to evict you.
No.
But it does happen.
Yeah.
I had a friend who got evicted from his place because a new family moved in as landlords. They kept him on for another year or so, and then they had a kid, and then they said, oh, well, now we want our basement apartment back to be just a basement.
Yeah.
And so then he got evicted. Now, the thing is, getting evicted for whatever reason, because the landlord wants to take over the space or whatever, that's a risk as a renter that you're going to take. You can mitigate it a bit. You can stretch it out so that instead of just having 1 year of guaranteed tenancy, you can make it longer, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, depending on whatever you and the landlord can come to an agreement on the lease. And usually, again, good landlords want good tenants for a long time.
Yeah.
That's usually not a hard sell for a landlord if you're a tenant. At least not in my experience. But
no, not if you've kind of proved, like if you already proved your relationship. Coming in and asking for a 5-year lease off the top when you don't know each other probably isn't going to work. But if you've been there for a year,
I mean, it might. If you screen well, if you got
true.
money up front and good jobs and good reference letters and all that stuff, and you're sort of coming in and being like, look, I have one of these little things and it's really squirmy and I don't want to have to move all of its toys again. Can I have a 5-year lease? That might also help. So that's a risk as a tenant, the risk that you're going to get evicted. But it's only happened to one person in my circle of acquaintances who rent, and he was there for 7 years before it happened.
Yeah.
So it's a risk. It's relatively unlikely. It gets played up a lot in the media, but I don't think it's really as likely as people say it is. And even then, it's a risk of inconvenience.
Yeah.
It sucks having to pack up all your stuff on 60 or 90 days notice, find a new place, go shopping around for another place. It really is just not nice. But again, if I can save $100,000 over 10 years, I'll take that risk every time.
It's also the flip side of flexibility. Like you play up that side, but it also is the fact that like, if you get a new job across the city, if you just want to, like if you win a small lottery and you want to travel for a year, you can just leave and you don't have to pay. Like depending on where you are in your lease, but like you can also sublet. Like there's a lot of options for you. And
and that's the other thing is you get a long lease to protect you. The landlord has some protections in that lease because basically if you leave, you have to find another tenant willing to pay at least as much as you were that the landlord accepts, reasonably accepts. Which is not super hard. So, I mean, you might leave and then your 5-year lease, you might have to pay an extra couple of months rent. Again, compared to the transaction cost of owning, if you had to leave for another job or whatever, that's not very much.
It's huge. And the inconvenience of having to leave your own house is like not only just the financial cost, but like that's a huge thing to try to sell and try to do all these kind of things. And it's like it's a bigger... There's always a flip side to all these things. There's a strength and a weakness, and it's just like, this is life. But it's easy to get sucked into because the stories do suck. And you're like, and then that person got evicted and the landlord was terrible. And like, Of course, those are the stories that we hear. It sucks to
Yeah.
hear stories about terrible people, but that doesn't mean that most people aren't pretty decent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we often hear is that, well, renting is less flexible. I've even heard quite often, surprising, that people say, oh, well, I want to paint the walls and hang pictures. Like, well, paint the walls and hang pictures. Like, this is something you can do as a tenant. You can
Yeah.
paint the walls and hang pictures. That's totally fine. The only thing is that you either have to get permission from the landlord to leave it that way, or paint it back to the way that you found it when you leave. That's all. So, this is not a real requirement. And then it's like, well, if I want to knock down a wall, what do I do?
Yeah.
So then as a tenant, you have, the sort of two responses to that is that most of the time when people are knocking down walls when they buy a place, it's right at the beginning. So you just find a place as a tenant that you like as it is, and then you go live there. And then you don't have to knock down any walls. You don't have to live in a construction zone for 8 months that you originally thought was only going to be 3 and all that stuff.
And if you live a place for a year and you're like, you know what? I hate that this kitchen isn't bigger. You go find a place with a bigger kitchen.
Yes.
You don't have to change
you might have
this
to look
place
for a couple of months to find one, especially if you're looking for a detached house, because they are rarer than condos.
Yes.
So the search might take a little bit longer, but eventually you'll find the place that's for you. And then also, if you do really want to renovate, there are some landlords who will let you renovate. If you want to sign a 5 or 10-year lease and then build in the provisions that, the renovation is going to cost this much, the landlord will provide materials, the tenant will provide labor, or, whatever you want to do to make that work. Maybe the tenant will pay the lease rate that the unimproved property would normally have got, which is what the landlord's going to get anyway if you, the creative tenant, isn't coming in.
Yeah, totally.
And then you go and you pay for the renovation, so then you get to live in the renovations just for the cost of whatever it put in, which you would have done anyway if you were an owner, and then have the lower cost of whatever the dump that you were going to rent would have costed. Then, I mean, that's sort of win-win. And then when you eventually leave, the landlord has this nicely renovated place, so they get to bump the rent on the next tenant. And then in the meantime, for 5, 7, 10 years, you get to enjoy that nicely renovated, personalized space for you. I mean, again, these are much rarer than renovating your own house as an owner, but it's not impossible.
But only rare because we don't talk about them, and it's probably not discussed
and also
even between a
because
landlord
of
and a
that
tenant.
Life stage issue.
Exactly, because this, what you're talking about right now, right at the beginning when we were talking about the idea of like what's in between these two life stages, or what's in between these two options. Let's take the life stage out of the equation. This is what's in between. Like, it is a spectrum, and so what you can say is like, at the end of renting, if the spectrum over here is like pure just normal renting, which you always think about, and over here is complete ownership, there is this area where it's more secure, more stable. You have a different kind of relationship with your landlord, and you can take more ownership over the space, and you can create. And yes, it might be harder to find a place in a landlord, but it's also hard to find a piece of property that you really like. It's a
especially
different
in
kind
this
of
current
searching.
Toronto market.
Exactly. So it's just like recognizing options. And the biggest takeaway that both I'm taking and kind of would want to like lay out is like the idea of looking at the prices, writing down all these intangible things that you really feel, whether they're rational or irrational, whatever you're feeling that you're like, I really want this. But finding some way to put a price on it, whether it's one of the ways that you've talked about already, and saying, are these things worth this amount of money? $100,000 in 10 years. Is this worth pride of ownership? Is this worth really being able to knock down a wall at a whim? Is it worth these things that I'm putting value? Is it worth that kind of not feeling a twinge of shame that you don't really even agree with and probably would disappear in 5 seconds? Like, that's a decent place to at least start making a more deliberate decision than I think
and try to really carefully define what it is that you want. Because again, a lot of people jump. They say they really want to live in a detached house and raise a kid.
Yeah.
And so they jump from, I really want to live in a detached house and raise a kid, and then start to pursue what all the various ways of making that happen are. Jump from that to, well, I'm going to buy.
So is that step zero? Is step zero really defining what you want and exploring the different options, like really trying to
Yeah,
explore the different options of how you can get that, and only not making buy the only option before kind
that's
of
right.
step
Yeah,
one of,
don't jump. Yeah,
yeah,
you're skipping steps if you go straight to, okay, let me find the house that I'm going to buy. Well, no, find, if you want to live in a house, find what you might be able to live in and what the various options are. If you don't live in a city like Toronto, if you live in Montreal or Halifax, you
yeah,
might look at the rental options and go, well, I'm surprised there are rental options for detached houses, but they're just as expensive
yeah,
as owning, or
yeah,
maybe even more expensive than owning. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and own. Now, if you live in Toronto or Vancouver, maybe even Calgary or Edmonton, you might go, ooh, this is actually a better option financially. And then you think about the other risks that you're taking on and some of the intangibles, and well, maybe actually it's a better option in a large number of ways.
yeah, yeah. I like it. I like it. Step zero, you have to live somewhere. Decide what kind of living situation you want, and then start getting creative about how you can make that happen. That's all for our conversation today. If you've got any rent versus buy questions, feel free to send us a note here at Because Money. If you like hearing us chat about money, why not tell a friend? Heck, tell 10 friends or even more. I promise, if you tell 10 friends to listen, maybe we'll bring Sandy back for the next episode. As always, thanks so much for listening, and have yourself a great week.
Goodbye.